Variances play an important role in the B3 guidelines to address unique project constraints. The B3 guidelines differ from other rating systems in that it primarily consists of a set of required measures for all projects rather than a menu of optional sustainability strategies. Due to the variability of B3 projects, some might require adaptations to the performance thresholds and/or documentation schedule. So the B3 guidelines allow for the use of variances to provide this accommodation under certain circumstances. Two types of variances are available for project teams to use. The first is a provisional variance. Provisional variances are designed for projects that are ready to move on to the next phase, but can't currently complete all required guidelines. Provisional variances are temporary and only apply to the phase they're requested in. If the issue preventing guideline completion persists for multiple phases, the provisional variance must be re-requested at each phase. However, provisional variances cannot be requested during the last phase a guideline is required. At that time, the guideline must be completed, or a full variance or non-compliant designation must be requested. The second type of variance is a full variance. Unlike provisional variances, a full variance is permanent. Full variances can be requested for programmatic reasons when guideline requirements interfere with the intended use or program of the building or site. Full variances can also be requested due to technological limitations, when available technologies or methodologies do not enable the project to meet B3 requirements. When requesting a full variance, the project team must pursue creative solutions to meet the intent of the guideline as much as possible. Full variances should not be requested for the following reasons. They will not be considered based on budgetary or project schedule constraints, nor will they be considered for requirements missed by the project team that cannot be addressed at a later phase. Meeting the guidelines may require adjustments to the standard design and construction processes used by the project team. This is not an accepted justification for a variance. Having a small or irregular site is also not an automatic reason for a variance, although these projects may choose to follow the small buildings and/or small sites methods, which better account for the limitations of small projects. Guidelines that are recommended rather than required don't need variances. Project teams can just choose not to pursue these guidelines. And finally, variances should not be used for guidelines that are unrelated to the project scope. Instead, these should be communicated to the B3 guidelines administrators so they can be removed from the project dashboard. If the project team can't document compliance with a guideline and there's no satisfactory reason why a variance should be considered, the project will be designated as not compliant with the guideline. This designation is only available at the last phase the guideline is required. Before that, the project team should use provisional variances while attempting to solve the issue, and only pursue not compliant status as a last resort. All non-compliant designations are shown publicly on the B3 case studies database, as shown in the image on the right. Variance requests and non-compliant designations are handled within the B3 guidelines tracking tool. First, the project team submits the variance request. Next, the request is reviewed by the project's guideline leader, the B3 guidelines administrators, and the agency contact, who determines whether to approve or reject the variance request. For provisional variances, the request must clearly identify the reason the variance is required and describe next steps for complying with the guideline in later phases. A request for a full variance must identify the reason for the variance and describe how it meets one of the program's allowed justifications. It must describe how the project team exhausted reasonable alternative approaches and explored creative solutions to maintain the intent of the guideline. It must also identify a modified performance level and/or compliance method that will be pursued by the project team. For non-compliant designations, the request should describe why this designation is necessary. For any type of request, supporting documentation should be provided as needed. Here's a good example of a request for a provisional variance. The project team describes the reason the variance is needed, that they haven't been able to achieve compliance with the B3 daylight requirements during an early design stage. To meet the requirements, they need to increase daylight access. They're requesting a provisional variance so they have more time to redesign windows and other natural light features in their building, with the intent that the constructed building will meet the guideline requirements. Now let's look at a sample full variance. The reason the variance is needed is clearly stated. Due to the technological limitation of local markets in rural Minnesota, they cannot meet the required recycling rate. Next, they describe how they made every reasonable effort to meet the intent of the guideline, engaging a waste diversion consultant and exploring creative solutions like supplying gypsum board directly to a farm operator for use as a soil amendment. Lastly, they identify their modified approach and performance level, maximizing recycling rates for all waste streams with local facilities or markets through on-site sorting and regular status checks at construction meetings to achieve high diversion rates for those materials, though not meeting the overall B3 diversion requirement. Finally, let's look at some examples of unacceptable requests for full variances. The first identifies the problem but doesn't describe the specifics or propose an alternative solution. This should be rejected so that a more detailed variance request can be submitted. The second is requesting a full variance for an unacceptable reason, which is project schedule constraints. In addition, it does not describe specifics or next steps. This should also be rejected, and ideally, daylight modeling should be conducted to help the project become compliant. The third is also an unacceptable reason, in this case, a requirement missed by a project team that cannot be addressed later. This should be rejected and labeled not compliant. As always, questions about variances can be directed to the B3 Guidelines administrators.